The laughter had already started when Elena Reyes stepped into the nurse's station, and she knew immediately that it was about her. One of the senior nurses was holding her sleeve between two fingers, pulling the fabric just high enough to expose the dark edge of the tattoo on Elena's upper arm, while two younger staff members watched with barely concealed amusement. Someone whispered that tattoos belonged on people who worked in garages or bars, not in a hospital where patients trusted nurses with their lives. Elena gently pulled her sleeve back into place and said nothing. She had learned long ago that some people did not ask questions because they wanted answers. They asked because they wanted permission to judge. The emergency department was already having one of those mornings when everything seemed to happen at once. Phones rang from different corners of the station. Monitors chirped behind the curtain-lined treatment rooms. A porter hurried past with a wheelchair while a physician called for blood work from the opposite end of the corridor. Outside the tall windows, rain streaked the glass, turning the city beyond it into a gray blur of headlights and wet pavement. Elena moved through the noise with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years learning how to remain steady while everyone else was losing their balance. Her dark hair was pulled tightly into a bun. Her navy scrubs were clean but slightly faded from too many washes. A small silver watch rested against her wrist, its glass scratched near the edge. Nothing about her suggested someone who wanted attention. That was precisely why the tattoo seemed to bother people so much. It was only partially visible beneath her sleeve, a small black emblem formed from lines that looked almost military in their precision. Most people who saw it assumed it was decorative. Some assumed it was a symbol of rebellion. Nobody knew that Elena had never chosen it for fashion. She had chosen it because there were certain names she refused to forget. At 36, Elena had become very good at letting other people misunderstand her. She had been underestimated by patients who thought a young-looking nurse could not possibly understand what they were going through. She had been dismissed by doctors who mistook her quiet manner for uncertainty. She had learned to answer arrogance with competence and cruelty with silence. But that morning, the jokes were different. They were louder. They had an audience. One of the nurses, a woman named Marissa, leaned against the counter and smiled. She asked Elena whether the tattoo had come with a leather jacket and a motorcycle. Another person laughed. Elena checked the medication tray in front of her and continued working. Her fingers remained steady. Only the slight tightening around her eyes revealed that she had heard every word. Then the emergency doors burst open. Two paramedics rushed inside with a stretcher between them. The mood changed instantly. The laughter disappeared as if someone had switched off a light. A man in a soaked tactical jacket lay on the stretcher, pale and barely responsive. His breathing was shallow. His right hand was clenched tightly around a piece of torn fabric. One paramedic shouted that the patient had collapsed after a training incident, and that his condition had deteriorated during transport. Elena moved toward him before anyone told her to. She checked his airway, watched his breathing, and studied the color of his skin. The others began preparing equipment. A physician arrived seconds later and started issuing instructions. Elena noticed something that seemed insignificant at first. The man's left pupil reacted differently from his right. She pointed it out immediately. The physician leaned closer, checked again, and ordered another assessment. The room became more urgent. Elena remained calm. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she prepared the equipment and relayed information. The man suddenly became less responsive. Everyone around the bed accelerated, but Elena seemed to slow down. She watched the monitor. She watched his chest. She remembered a training lesson from years earlier, something most nurses would never have needed outside a textbook. She called for the physician and explained what she suspected. The doctor listened, adjusted the treatment plan, and within moments the patient's condition began to stabilize. No one congratulated Elena. There was no time. But one person had been watching from the doorway. He was taller than nearly everyone around him, broad-shouldered beneath a dark military uniform, with reins still shining across the fabric near his shoulders. His face was controlled, almost expressionless, but his eyes moved quickly across the room. He looked first at the injured man, then at the medical team, then at Elena. Something in his expression changed. Elena noticed him only briefly before turning back toward the patient. She had seen military officers before. She had treated soldiers, veterans, police officers, firefighters, and civilians from every possible background. She had learned not to be impressed by uniforms. But the man standing in the doorway was different. There was a stillness about him that did not belong to ordinary authority. He carried himself like someone accustomed to making decisions when there was no room for hesitation. A hospital administrator hurried toward him and began explaining the situation. The officer barely seemed to hear. His attention remained fixed on Elena. Then his gaze dropped toward her arm. Elena's sleeve had shifted during the emergency. The edge of the tattoo was visible again. The officer froze. For several seconds, nobody noticed. Then he stepped closer. Elena looked up. Their eyes met. The man's face lost its professional composure. Not fear. Not confusion. Recognition. His gaze remained on the tattoo as though the small black symbol had opened a door to a memory he had spent years trying to keep closed. Elena instinctively pulled her sleeve down. The officer whispered something under his breath. Elena could not hear him. He took one more step forward. The nurses nearby began watching. Marissa, who had been joking about the tattoo only minutes earlier, slowly straightened from the counter. The officer looked at Elena again and asked the question in a voice so quiet that everyone in the room had to stop talking to hear it. He asked where she had gotten that tattoo. Elena's expression changed for the first time that morning. The color seemed to leave her face. She looked toward the injured man on the stretcher, then back at the officer. For years, she had believed that the past could stay buried if she refused to speak its name. But now a decorated SEAL commander was standing in the middle of her emergency department, staring at the one mark she had never explained to anyone, and asking a question that meant he already knew far more than he should have. And before Elena could answer, the commander slowly raised his hand toward the tattoo, stopped himself, and looked at her with an expression that made every person in the room understand one thing. This was not the first time he had seen that symbol. Elena did not answer the commander. Not immediately. Her eyes remained on the injured man, because looking at him was easier than looking at the memory standing in front of her. The emergency department had become strangely quiet around them. The monitors still beeped. Rain still tapped against the windows. Somewhere behind a curtain, a patient was asking for water. But for Elena, the room seemed to have narrowed to one question and one symbol beneath her sleeve. The commander waited. He did not repeat himself. He simply watched her with the patience of someone who understood that certain answers could not be forced. Finally, Elena pulled the sleeve back over the tattoo and said that it was an old reminder from a difficult time in her life. Nothing more. The commander studied her face. He seemed to understand that she was protecting something, but before he could respond, the injured officer suddenly deteriorated again. The monitor changed. A nurse called for the physician. Elena turned instantly toward the bed. Whatever history existed between her and the commander could wait. A life could not. She moved beside the patient and began assessing him again. The physician ordered additional medication, but Elena hesitated. Something was wrong. The numbers were changing too quickly. She remembered the earlier difference in his pupils and the unusual way his breathing had shifted. She quietly told the physician that the treatment might be making the underlying problem worse. The doctor frowned. He asked whether she was certain. Elena looked at the monitor, then at the patient. She knew what would happen if she was wrong. Everyone in that room would remember the nurse who challenged a physician in front of a decorated military commander. Her coworkers were already watching. Marissa stood near the medication cabinet, her expression no longer amused. Elena could feel every eye on her. She could also feel the old fear rising inside her, the fear of speaking when silence would be safer. Then she looked at the patient's hand. His fingers were still wrapped around the torn piece of fabric. Something about it caught her attention. There was a faint stitch symbol on the fabric, almost identical to the mark on her arm. Elena stopped breathing for a second. The past had not simply followed her into the hospital. It had arrived on the stretcher. She told the physician exactly what she believed was happening. This time he listened. The treatment was adjusted. The patient's breathing gradually stabilized. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then the commander stepped toward the bed and looked at Elena with an expression that was no longer guarded. He knew. He knew exactly what the tattoo meant. One of the younger nurses quietly asked him whether he had seen it before. The commander did not answer. Instead, he asked Elena to come with him into the hallway. She refused. She said she needed to remain with the patient. The commander nodded. Then he said something that made her hands stop moving. He told her that years ago, during an operation that had gone terribly wrong, someone had carried that same symbol into a place where almost nobody expected to survive. Elena's face hardened. She told him that person was gone. The commander looked at her for a long moment, and said that was what everyone had been told. The words hung between them. Marissa glanced toward the other nurses, suddenly uncomfortable. The same people who had laughed at Elena's tattoo now stood silently, realizing that the mark they had mocked might represent something far greater than they had imagined. Elena refused to let their embarrassment become her concern. She returned to the patient and continued working. Her movements were calm, but her thoughts were no longer in the hospital. They were years away, inside a night she had spent countless hours trying not to remember. She remembered cold air. A broken radio. The sound of distant engines. She remembered a young man who had been frightened but refused to leave another person behind. She remembered making a promise. And she remembered the moment she had believed that promise would be the last thing she ever kept. The commander approached again after the patient was finally stable. This time he did not ask about the tattoo. He asked Elena whether she still remembered the names of the men who had been there that night. Elena looked at him. She said she remembered everyone. The commander's jaw tightened. He reached inside his uniform and removed a small worn photograph. He did not hand it to her immediately. He simply held it between them. Elena saw the edge of the image and already knew what she was going to see. When he finally turned it around, the room seemed to disappear. The photograph showed a group of young service members standing beside a damaged transport vehicle. They were smiling, exhausted, and alive. Elena's eyes moved across the faces until they stopped on one person. A young man stood at the center, his arm resting on another soldier's shoulder. Around his wrist was the same symbol Elena carried beneath her sleeve. But there was something else. Elena recognized the man standing beside him. It was the commander, years younger, before the gray had appeared at his temples. The commander watched Elena's reaction and quietly explained that the man in the photograph had saved several lives that night. Then he said the part that Elena had never expected to hear. The man had not been a soldier at all. He had been a civilian nurse who had volunteered to accompany the team after an emergency evacuation went wrong. Elena's throat tightened. The commander looked directly into her eyes and said that the nurse had disappeared afterward, leaving everyone to believe she had died. Elena lowered her gaze. Her hands trembled for the first time. The commander continued, telling her that the team had searched for her for months, but no one had ever found her. Then he looked down at the tattoo beneath her sleeve. He said the symbol had been created by the survivors in her honor. Elena finally understood why he had recognized it. But before she could explain that the story was not what he believed, the commander placed the photograph in her hand and whispered that there was one detail the military records had never contained. The nurse had not disappeared that night. Someone had helped her escape. And the person who helped her had left behind a message that the commander had only recently discovered. Elena stared at the photograph as the commander revealed that the message contained her name. Elena stared at the photograph until the faces blurred beneath the fluorescent lights, and for a moment she was no longer standing in a hospital hallway surrounded by people who had spent the morning laughing at the mark on her arm. She was remembering a different night, a different woman, and a decision that had followed her for years. The commander waited without speaking. He had spent years believing that the nurse in the photograph had vanished after saving his team, and now he was finally standing in front of the woman who had carried the truth alone. Elena slowly told him what had really happened. She had never been the nurse who disappeared. She had been the nurse who stayed behind after the evacuation, treating injured civilians while the military team was being extracted. The person the commander believed had vanished was another nurse, Elena's closest friend, who had taken Elena's identification when she realized that Elena was too injured to survive another evacuation. The tattoo had been created afterward, not as a symbol of military service, but as a promise between two women who had agreed that if one survived, she would carry the other's memory. Elena had spent years refusing to explain it because explaining meant reopening a night she had worked hard to survive. The commander listened without interrupting. Then he looked at the photograph again and understood the mistake that had remained buried inside the records. The nurse everyone had believed was Elena had actually been her friend. Elena had been the person who stayed behind and kept treating the wounded until help finally arrived. She had never considered herself a hero. She had simply done what she believed needed to be done. The commander lowered his head. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. He told Elena that the man on the stretcher was one of the young service members she had helped years ago. He had never forgotten the nurse who kept him alive that night, even though he had never known her name. Elena looked through the glass toward the treatment room. The injured man was awake now. His eyes were open. He asked for the nurse. Elena entered quietly. He looked at her for several seconds, then stared at the tattoo visible beneath her sleeve. His expression changed. He did not know her name, but something in his face told her that memory had found him before words could. He reached for her hand and simply said thank you. Elena closed her fingers gently around his. She did not tell him that she had carried the memory of that night for years. She did not tell him how many times she had wondered whether anyone remembered. She only told him that he was safe now. Outside the room, the nurses who had mocked her stood in silence. Marissa looked at the floor. The jokes from that morning suddenly seemed painfully small. The commander stepped into the center of the hallway and turned toward the hospital staff. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He told them that the tattoo they had mocked belonged to a woman who had once stayed behind when leaving would have been easier, who had treated people when she was frightened, and who had never once asked anyone to call her brave. He told them that courage was rarely loud enough for strangers to recognize immediately. Then he looked at Elena. Slowly, deliberately, the commander straightened his posture and saluted her. Nobody moved. Elena looked almost uncomfortable beneath the attention. She lowered her eyes and asked him to stop. She said she had only done her job. The commander answered that sometimes doing your job when nobody is watching is the clearest definition of courage. The words settled over the hallway. Marissa stepped forward. Her face was pale with embarrassment. She apologized for the jokes. Elena accepted the apology without making the moment cruel. She told her that people often judged what they could see because they were afraid of what they could not understand. Then she pulled her sleeve down over the tattoo once more. The commander watched her do it and smiled faintly. He understood that the mark did not need to remain visible for its meaning to exist. Later that afternoon, the hospital returned to its normal rhythm. Phones rang. Patients arrived. Nurses hurried through corridors. Doctors argued over schedules. Somewhere, someone dropped a metal tray and laughed when it clattered across the floor. Life had continued. Elena returned to the nurse's station and picked up the same medication chart she had been reviewing before the ambulance arrived. Nothing about the hospital had changed, yet something inside the people around her had. They looked at her differently now, not because she had become more important, but because they had finally taken the time to see what had always been there. The commander eventually left after speaking with the patient. Before he walked through the emergency doors, he stopped beside Elena. He told her that for years he had carried guilt because he believed he had failed to find the person who saved his team. Elena told him that he had not failed. Some people simply survive long enough to become part of someone else's future. The commander smiled, thanked her, and walked away. Elena watched the doors close behind him. Then she looked down at her sleeve. Beneath the fabric was the same small tattoo that had caused laughter that morning. It had not changed. The lines were still faded. The ink was still imperfect. But now its meaning felt different. It was not a badge. It was not a demand for recognition. It was a quiet promise that some lives should never become forgotten simply because the people who saved them chose not to speak about it. Elena returned to her patients. She adjusted a blanket, checked a monitor, reassured an anxious family, and moved through the hospital exactly as she had before. The difference was that nobody laughed when they saw the edge of the tattoo anymore. And perhaps that was the quietest justice of all. Because the world often notices the mark before it notices the person who carries it, but a life of courage is rarely written on the skin for strangers to read. It is written in the people who are still alive because someone chose to stay. If this story reminded you that there may be more behind a person than what you can see, carry that thought with you the next time you meet someone whose story you do not know. Sometimes the smallest mark can hold the weight of an entire lifetime. And sometimes the bravest people are the ones who never ask anyone to know what they have done. Long after the hospital lights dimmed that evening, Elena walked down the quiet corridor with her sleeve pulled gently over the tattoo, carrying the past without being imprisoned by it, while behind her the doors closed softly, and the mark beneath her sleeve remained what it had always been, a promise that the forgotten would not be forgotten,